So I think I've made it pretty clear at this point that I really like Worms 3D. I don't think the game's a masterpiece or anything, but I think it's genuinely pretty great, and it's very charming, and for a first attempt at a 3D Worms game, it's shockingly strong. At this point, I've made 3 videos on the game, one of which was over an hour long. And I'm sure a few people think that's a little odd. If you're a fan of 3D Worms, you'd know we're a little bit starved for options. There are only 4 3D Worms games, and one of them is a remake. And it just so happens that that remake, on top of being the most recent 3D Worms game, is the only one that's available on Steam today. And I have some thoughts about it. I think for most people, Worms Ultimate Mayhem is the definitive 3D Worms game, and that makes perfect sense. It's the one with the most stuff in it, it's the one most recently released, and again, it's the one you can actually buy on Steam, so it's inevitably going to be the one that the most people have ended up with. Now, I've lamented the fact that Worms 3D in particular was never digitally re-released multiple times. There is no way of buying this game today other than just finding a used copy out in the wild. Although, it seems that to a lot of people, this isn't really an issue. What's the point of digitally re-releasing Worms 3D when Worms Ultimate Mayhem is right there? Again, Worms Ultimate Mayhem is supposedly the definitive 3D Worms game, and it features content from both Worms 3D and Worms 4 Mayhem. So, even if Worms 3D and Worms 4 Mayhem were never digitally re-released, it's fine, right? Both games are represented in Ultimate Mayhem, right? I like Worms Ultimate Mayhem. I think it's a very fun game. But I think it's a very fun game because it's an adequate remake of an already very fun game, that being Worms 4 Mayhem. And both Worms 4 Mayhem and Worms Ultimate Mayhem are great games in their own right, but they're just not Worms 3D. They are fundamentally extremely different. Like I said, Worms Ultimate Mayhem features content from both Worms 3D and Worms 4 Mayhem, along with a small handful of additions that are completely unique to Ultimate Mayhem. And it's specifically how the Worms 3D content was handled that gets under my skin a little bit. That being said, that's not all I want to talk about here. I think it's worth talking about how things were changed going from Worms 3D to Worms 4 Mayhem, given that's the engine this game uses, and differences from Worms 4 Mayhem and Worms Ultimate Mayhem. This is probably the only time I'm going to talk about Worms Ultimate Mayhem, so I think it makes sense to cover as much ground as possible. Now, this is probably going to end up being one of my most critical videos, and it might feel like at times I don't have that much nice to say about Worms Ultimate Mayhem, but I can't stress enough that I do genuinely quite like the game. This is less me bashing on Worms Ultimate Mayhem, and more me knocking on Team 17's door and going, hey, that game you made 13 years ago, that's pretty good, but you fucked up this part here real bad, and I'm not happy about it. One last thing that's worth mentioning before I get into gameplay stuff is that nearly all of my Worms Ultimate Mayhem footage was recorded on the unofficial anniversary patch, which features a huge number of visual improvements. While it looks a lot better, I'm fully aware that comparing official releases is the name of the game here, so where necessary I will be using footage from the emulated PS3 version. First of all, I'm going to talk about some gameplay things that were changed going from Worms 3D to Worms 4 Mayhem, since the Worms 4 Mayhem engine is what everything in Worms Ultimate Mayhem uses. Worms 3D and Worms 4 Mayhem have some very notable differences in how they play, and you'll notice that even just like making your way around the terrain. Worms move faster in Worms 4 Mayhem than they do in Worms 3D, which you could argue is an improvement, but what I would argue isn't an improvement is the fact that Worms will slide off steep slopes in Worms 4 Mayhem. I find this really frustrating personally. I've had so many instances where I've gone for a jump that looked totally doable in Worms 4 Mayhem, only to slide off and land on my ass. I am really not a fan of it, and it's especially prevalent in Worms Ultimate Mayhem, because trying to traverse some of the Worms 3D maps in this game can really get on your nerves. Worms 3D and Worms 4 Mayhem have completely different lineups of weapons and utilities available, and it's the Worms 4 one that's used in Worms Ultimate Mayhem, which personally I'm a little mixed on. First of all, this just means that you're missing a lot of weapons I quite liked from Worms 3D, such as the Scales of Justice and the Earthquake. Granted, there's a few stinkers that are gone as well, like the Mortar and the Uzi. The Uzi's great in 2D Worms, but it never really worked in 3D. Although one little oddity is that there's one weapon that was present in Worms 3D, that was missing in Worms 4 Mayhem, that was added to Worms Ultimate Mayhem. And it's the binoculars of all things. The binoculars were pretty useless in Worms 3D, but I can forgive their inclusion because, I don't know, it was their first 3D Worms, maybe there's some kind of logic behind it. Maybe it's like, oh, our players are going to be so dazzled by this 3D world we made, they'll want to look at every nook and cranny of it. Or maybe they were thinking of people playing on very small, low-resolution CRTs. And I mean, I guess they have some slightly improved functionality in Ultimate Mayhem. But for being the only weapon you added, this is weird. It doesn't really do anything. I'm not sure what the thinking behind this is, but doesn't really make the game worse. Even weapons that feature in both Worms 3D and Worms 4 Mayhem can function differently between the two games, and for the most part, again, I think this is a mixed bag, but there is some stuff I really like in Worms 4 Mayhem. For a start, I really like how Worms 4 Mayhem handled the dynamic between the bazooka and the grenade. In Worms 3D, the bazooka could do up to 55 damage, and the grenade could do up to 50. The game tells you it's 45, but it is just lying to you. I promise it's 50. This is a holdover from the 2D Worms games, where it's generally a lot easier to hit the opponent with a grenade thanks to its ability to interact with the terrain. However, this is just not the case in the 3D games at all, and it's way harder to pull off. The grenade was not only weaker, but significantly harder to use. It was pretty frustrating. However, Worms 4 Mayhem actually addressed this, and it's the only game in the series, unless you also count Ultimate Mayhem, where the grenade is actually stronger than the bazooka, with the grenade doing 55 and the bazooka doing 50. I really like this. I think it's a great change. There were situations in Ultimate Mayhem where I've actually wanted to use the grenade over the bazooka, which very rarely came up in Worms 3D. Girders were handled in a similar way, and again, I really like it. In Worms 3D, placing a girder uses up your turn, which again is a holdover from the 2D games where they're much better. In Worms 4 Mayhem, you can place a girder and continue your turn, which is really nice. You can use it to make a jump that you wouldn't be able to make usually, you can use it for protection. There's a lot of cool options, but it's kept in check by the fact that you can only place one per turn, and the ability to make the girder large was removed going from Worms 3D to Worms 4 Mayhem. Again, I really like this. I think it's a smart change. A change that I'm a little more mixed on in Worms 4 Mayhem that I respect the shit out of regardless is the fact that poison is massively buffed. In Worms 3D, poison deals anywhere from 3 to 5 damage per turn depending on the weapon that inflicted it, and all of those weapons don't do any damage outside of the poison they inflict, with the exception of the blowpipe doing a single point of damage on contact. Up until Worms 4 Mayhem, poison was historically very weak, and Worms 4 Mayhem was not fucking having it, because they buffed it through the roof. There are 3 weapons in Worms 4 Mayhem that inflict poison. The gas canister, which is mostly the same as Worms 3D, the landmine, which now inflicts poison where it didn't in Worms 3D, and the poison arrow, which is completely new to Worms 4 Mayhem. On top of that, poison has been buffed from 3 to 5 per turn to 10 per turn, which, like, holy shit, like, I respect the shit out of it again, but, like, I kind of wonder if this was actually too much. Like, maybe keeping everything the same, but making the poison damage 5 per turn would have been the move, but I don't know, I kind of fuck with it. Like I said, there are changes I don't love. While I do enjoy the bazooka damage nerf, they also buffed the homing missile, and now the bazooka and the homing missile do the same damage at 50, which, I don't, that feels wrong. Now one is just kind of better all the time if you have access to it. It's a bit much. On top of that, landmines have a larger detection radius than they do in Worms 3D. I think this is cool for multiplayer because it allows more combo opportunities where you launch your opponent into mines, but there is one Worms 3D mission in Worms Ultimate Mayhem that I think suffers for this change that I'll talk about later. They also buffed the shotgun of all things going from Worms 3D to Worms 4 Mayhem. The damage is the same, but it does much more knockback in Worms 4 Mayhem, which, like, that's fucking bananas. That was already one of the best weapons in Worms 3D. Like, what are we doing here? And in fact, both of these weapons I just mentioned got an indirect buff thanks to another change that I'll talk about now. You see, in Worms 4 Mayhem, it's significantly easier for blast-type weapons to do their maximum possible damage values. If you drop a dynamite right next to someone in Worms 3D, it's very rarely going to do 75 damage. It's probably going to do like 70 to 73 if you're lucky. In Worms 4 Mayhem, no, you're pretty much getting 75 every time. This sounds like a good change, but honestly, I'm not over the moon about it personally. I don't know how I feel about a dynamite into a single shotgun shot doing 100 damage basically every time, or the exact same deal with a bazooka into a homing missile. Just feels a bit off to me, and it feels like it takes a little bit of that on-the-fly strategy out of Worms that I really, really value. I'm curious where other people stand on this change, because I haven't heard a lot about it, but I'm not over the moon personally. I mentioned earlier that I really like what they did with landmines in Worms 4 Mayhem, and while that is true, there's a change that they make very apparent, and that's the fact that weapons, specifically blast weapons, can launch you without actually dealing damage. This sounds kind of cool, and it's led to some cool moments and funny stuff, but it feels like they have a massive blast radius to compensate for this. It's hard for me to get across why this can be a problem now, but I'll definitely touch on it later. This leads to some real goofy shit. Landmines in Worms 4 Mayhem are also a little bit random. They don't always produce a poison cloud. Sometimes they send clusters out, and sometimes they do neither, but launch the opponent really far. I'm kind of mixed on this. On one hand, it's kind of fun, but on the other hand, these vary pretty drastically in how useful they are. A lot of my big complaints stem from the new weapons. There is some cool shit in here, like the sniper rifle, the starburst, and I already talked about the poison arrow. But there is some stuff in here that just, like, really actually fucking sucks. There's some really stupid gimmicky shit, like the alien abduction and the... oh fuck, what is it called? The sentry gun. I hate the sentry gun. Don't like that. Not cool. And more importantly, there is, like, one of the most fucking boneheaded things I've ever seen put in a game. And that's the fucking tail nail. It's a melee weapon that does 15 damage and removes the... I'm so mad. Removes the enemy's movement. They can't move. They can't move anymore. They're stuck there until they get, like, blasted out of the little hole that they're in. In Worms, you remove the enemy's movement in Worms. Like, that's so... it's like one of the most anti-fun things I've ever seen in my life. I don't even know how good this shit is. Like, maybe this is overpowered, maybe it's... I don't care. I don't care. I think if you're playing, like, Worms Ultimate Mayhem with an actual human being, I think you got a gentleman to not use this shit. It's not okay. That you can't do that. And one last thing that I don't like, and this one's for me. This is the kind of shit that only I would care about. I don't like that we lost the nuclear test. The Flood. The nuclear test in Worms 3D is very, very cool. And there's a lot of cool decision making that stems from it. It is the only weapon in Worms 3D that raises the water level, which is huge. That's a very powerful thing to do. But it poisons every single worm on the field except the worm who uses the nuclear test. And it's the strong poison. It does 5 per turn. So, like, you gotta think about a lot of shit here. This is kind of neat. Like, okay, let's say you want to raise the water level, like it would drown one of the enemy's worms. Is doing that worth poisoning all your worms, except for the one that uses it? What if you want to use it twice in a row? Like, you raise the water twice, that's pretty bananas, but now all of your worms are poisoned. And also, what if there's a health crate on the field, right? Because that'll cure poison. So you use the nuclear test, all of your worms are poisoned except for one, and yeah, all the enemy worms are poisoned, but now they can just go and get the health crate, and now they can cure one of their worms. And what if you don't even want the water? Like, let's say you have relatively few worms, and they've got a lot. Maybe you want to use the nuclear test for the poison and not the water. Like, there's so much to think about. It's a really cool weapon. In Worms 4 Mayhem, you have the Flood, and it raises the water and doesn't do anything else. Yeah, this is the kind of thing that I get bothered by. I'm sorry. Moving away from weapons and utilities, there are plenty of other gameplay changes that I want to touch on. For a start, Worms 4 Mayhem uses a different random landscape generator, something very important to Worms, and unfortunately I think it's a huge downgrade from Worms 3D. For a start, there are 5 themes instead of 6, but more importantly, it's a lot less customizable and a lot less interesting. Worms 3D's random landscape generator was so dynamic. It would give you, like, all these different islands and knickknacks to put on them. It could get so goofy with it. It was really cool. You could get really tiny maps, really huge maps, really spread out maps, ones with a shit ton of bridges. In Worms 4 Mayhem, you get differently shaped blobs of relatively flat terrain. and the stuff on them changes sometimes, and that's kind of it. And I think that kind of sucks. And this is the one in Ultimate Mayhem, which... On a lighter note, though, grave damage is much stronger in Worms 4 Mayhem than it is in Worms 3D. If you didn't know, grave damage is a term for the explosion that occurs when a worm dies, and I'm glad this is much better. It does more damage, it does way more knockback, and worms that fall into the water will always float to the surface and explode. Unlike in Worms 3D, where this only happened in shallow water. This is one of my absolute favourite changes in Worms 4 Mayhem, and of course it did carry over to Worms Ultimate Mayhem. Grave damage is one of the absolute coolest things in Worms, and there's a lot of really cool shit you can do with it. Unfortunately, it just didn't translate super well over to Worms 3D, so I'm glad they buffed the shit out of it to compensate. Unlike Worms 3D, you can use the ninja rope to push and pull crates, oil barrels, and landmines. Although it's a little tricky with landmines because the hitbox is a bit fucked up. For crates, I think this is really cool, but for landmines and oil barrels, this might be a bit much. You can very easily set up some incredibly fucked up scenarios. And the last thing I feel like getting grumpy about, although I wish I had more concrete evidence on this one, is that holy shit do the CPU feel dumber in Worms 4 Mayhem. What will he do? And that's a low bar, because they are not that smart in Worms 3D. Sometimes the enemy just take a really, really long time to decide what to do. And in situations where, like, Worms 3D CPUs would do something kind of dumb, but at least it's something, like, they can't shoot you, so they'll just shoot at terrain in your direction to kind of, like, create a way of looking at you so they can shoot you later. The Worms 4 Mayhem CPU just freaks out. Like, they'll shoot a shotgun straight in the air, specifically if they hit something with their first shot and don't know what to do with the second one. And I have had instances where, like, they just don't do anything. They just sit there and waste their entire turn. It's like, what the fuck are we doing here? What? Why don't I have that? Okay, actually, this is interesting. I want to see, what are they going to do for the second shot? I swear Ultimate Mayhem's... Yeah, Ultimate Mayhem CPUs are dumb as shit sometimes. What is he doing? He's so dupid.
Move it, lad!
And they do also feel a bit more prone to getting themselves killed. Which, granted, it's not super common. I think it's rare enough for it to be more funny than irritating. But it definitely happens more in Worms 4 Mayhem than it does in Worms 3D. It's not fully consistent. Like, sometimes the CPU in Ultimate Mayhem will try and damage the terrain to get to you, just like in Worms 3D. But I don't know if it's just me, but they don't feel as smart about it. Like, they're a lot more prone to damaging themselves or their teammates while doing that process. I might be imagining it, but I don't know. I've seen some pretty goofy stuff. I've managed to do a pacifist run of missions like D-Day, just because the CPU are that dumb when trying to get to me. It's kind of wild. So, that's enough for changes from Worms 3D to Worms 4 Mayhem. There's a few more small things, but I think that's enough for now. Anyways, let's move on to things that changed going from Worms 4 Mayhem to Worms Ultimate Mayhem. There's not a huge amount to talk about because one's a remake of the other, but there's still a bit, and I'm sorry to say it's not all good news. Worms Ultimate Mayhem has a few graphical quirks that I think most people would just say, yeah, that's wrong. For a start, the HUD is all kinds of fucked up. Things like aiming reticles and the worm select icon are bizarrely oversized. And there's other issues too, such as cutscenes for things like the airstrike being stretched 4x3, and also just general issues with the lighting. If you're playing on PC, you can fix this with the Worms Ultimate Mayhem Anniversary patch, which I would highly recommend, but if you're on console, you're unfortunately out of luck. And speaking of console, boy, those shadows, they look really bad. They look real fucked up. And what's weird is they look different kinds of fucked up depending on the console. Like, on the PS3 version, they just look really low resolution. And then, in the Xbox version, I don't even know what I'd call this. They just look like fucked up little poorly layered squares. There's something up here and I don't like it. The PC version isn't totally out of the woods, however, because another very common issue that occurs there is this awful mouse jitter. This I distinctly remember not happening a few years ago, and I booted up the game fairly recently and it was just like this. And in my opinion, this is like unacceptably bad. You can fix this with a patch again, but you shouldn't have to, because this makes the game borderline unplayable. It's really, really obnoxious. Another issue with Worms Ultimate Mayhem that I believe is most prominent in the PC version, the online. Holy shit, it's really fucking bad. The PC version of Worms Ultimate Mayhem has some of the most staggeringly awful online I've ever suffered through. First of all, there's barely any customization, no worm pot, you're not allowed to have more than 4 worms on your team, but the bigger issue is the delay. If you've ever played this game, like, while in a voice call with someone, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Your view of the opponent's turn is delayed by several seconds, and it just really kills the experience.
So, I'm gonna do a countdown, or?
Yeah, so, like, I'll go 3, 2, 1, and then you do it on 1, okay?
Yeah.
Cool,
Yeah.
cool. 3, 2, 1.
Move it, sunshine.
Jesus Christ. That's so dire.
It's like 10 seconds, right?
No, yeah, I thought it was gonna be like 5 or 6. That's so much worse
Yeah,
than I
because
thought.
when you did your turn, and it was like, and you were like,
Oh,
oh, I don't
God.
think I'm gonna make it. It was like 13 seconds left, and then it's like, oh, I made it, and it was just passed over to 9 seconds.
I've heard the online in the console ports is a little bit better, but unfortunately I haven't experienced it myself. But yeah, this is still, like, really fucking not cool, actually. Worms Ultimate Mayhem adds 6 brand new multiplayer maps and a bunch of new customization options, which sounds pretty cool, but the catch is basically all of it is either paid DLC or promotional items that require owning certain games on Steam, like Alien Breed. This is fine, I guess. It's new stuff. It's not very expensive DLC either. I don't know. This game doesn't add a huge amount to Worms 4 Mayhem, so, like, nearly all of the new stuff being DLC or locked behind owning shit just feels a little bad. There's also a bunch of brand new single player challenges, and they're in an especially strange spot because on console they're paid DLC, but on PC they're free DLC. It's a little bit odd, but it is what it is. Ultimate Mayhem fixes a handful of game-breaking bugs from Worms 4 Mayhem, notably this one that would let you spam infinite weapons using the Icarus potion. That's cool, but unfortunately they didn't catch everything. Notably this one that would let you stall your turn infinitely with the Icarus potion. This one's real bad. Hypothetically, if someone did this to you online, that is kind of checkmate. If they're willing to wait it out, you can just sit here waiting till the round time is up. It's kind of not cool. Several cutscenes in Worms 4 Mayhem that use this sort of worm speak are now fully voice acted. I think this is one of the more notable additions, and overall I'd say it's a good one.
Who's in the kitchen? I am. I'm testing the lighting. Let me know if the light comes on in there. Will do.
However, while we got some cool new audio in the form of voice acting, we lost some in the form of music. In Worms 4 Mayhem, all 5 of the unique level themes have 2 music tracks each, and unfortunately, in Ultimate Mayhem, they only have 1 each. It's worse off for the Worms 3D themes, since in Worms 3D they had 4 each, and again, we're down to 1. Another audio-related change comes from sound banks, which are the little voice packs that you can give your worms. Worms Ultimate Mayhem, compared to Worms 4 Mayhem, removes 1, adds 1, and then adds 5 more, but those 5 are all paid DLC. Unlike the missing music tracks, I don't think the removed voice bank is a result of laziness. It's based on some kind of gay British stereotype, and Jesus Christ. Some of the voice lines this voice bank has are truly wild.
first blow to me. Oh, did I say that? I like being spanked, but that was downright painful. Time to visit the big pink flamingo in the sky. Come on, Lovey, pull your finger out.
Not cool, Worms for Mayhem. Don't say that again. However, there is one other issue with voice banks in Worms Ultimate Mayhem that I'm going to be touching on quite soon because it relates to the Worms 3D content. Worms Ultimate Mayhem also adds the ability to save randomly generated landscapes that you're particularly fond of to play on later. I think this is a pretty cool change. It's a shame that it's here with the Worms 4 Mayhem random level generator because, again, I just don't think it's particularly good. But still, this is a nice addition. Overall, despite a few teething troubles, I'd say Worms 4 Mayhem has done pretty well for itself in Worms Ultimate Mayhem. That's so cool. I wonder how that other 3D Worms game did for itself. Okay, so I think I've made it pretty clear at this point that I'm not over the moon about how Worms 3D was treated in Worms Ultimate Mayhem. That being said, there are a few positive changes I want to talk about, so I'll give it its dues before I get into being a bit nitpicky and critical and annoying. First of all, when it comes to the Worms 3D campaign in Worms Ultimate Mayhem, that's the thing. This is Worms Ultimate Mayhem. And while I'm a little grumpy that the Worms 4 Mayhem physics engine isn't super well suited to the Worms 3D campaign, you do get the benefit of things like worm customization and widescreen. The customization in particular is quite cute because the enemy worms used to all look the same in Worms 3D, and now they have their own customization, like hats and stuff, which is kind of fun. I also gotta give a shout out to Mission 21 of the Worms 3D campaign, a quick fix, because it's by a mile the most improved mission in Worms Ultimate Mayhem, and in my opinion is significantly better than its appearance in Worms 3D. This is an extremely notorious mission, and a lot of people who played this game when they were younger, me included, got stuck on it forever. I personally got stuck on it for years, and I know people who just never ended up beating it, and this was the end of the campaign for them. To beat the mission, you need to place 6 landmines inside this computer, following a pattern in this book here. This is a really tedious process, because placing a landmine uses up your turn, and ideally you also have to kill off these enemy worms before you try and do this, because they'll attack you and just mess the whole thing up. Like, they'll launch you into the landmines, they'll knock the landmines around it. It's really annoying. In Ultimate Mayhem, the amount of landmines you need to place has been reduced from 6 to 3, and this one change makes the mission so much better. 1, it just makes it less boring, but 2, it makes placing all of the landmines you need without killing off the enemy worms a much more realistic process. In fact, if you want to get the time bonus on this mission, this seems like what you have to do, because it's actually quite tight. This one change improves the mission so much, and I much prefer it in Ultimate Mayhem. One slightly funny thing about this mission though, they did remove the Easter egg in Ultimate Mayhem, where you type Team 17 on the keyboard with your worm, but they left in this little pointer that tells you to do the Easter egg, which is kind of funny, but yeah, this mission is much better, genuinely. While I wouldn't say it's as improved, I also think that the 23rd mission, Trial of the Damned, is better off in Ultimate Mayhem. This mission is supposed to take place in this sort of, like, hell purgatory thing, and that's much more clear in Ultimate Mayhem since they've added this purple fog around the entire map. In Worms 3D, you can pretty easily tell that you're just, you know, in the sky above water, so yeah, this is genuinely a nice improvement. It's not perfect, however. If you fall off the map in Worms 3D, then this cutscene starts where it, like, zooms in on the, like, vortex in the middle of the stage, and that's fine, but in Ultimate Mayhem, if you fall off near that, you'll still see your worm. Your worm doesn't get deleted from existence, and you'll visibly see them make contact with the water, which kind of ruins the illusion a bit. Not a big deal, but unfortunate they made it visually better in one way and not in another way. There's also a nice gameplay improvement here. You're supposed to follow this linear path, and as you do, islands that you've already been on will explode. In Worms 3D, one of the islands you're supposed to jump to will get clipped by the explosion of the island behind it blowing up. So if you barely make the jump to the island you're supposed to jump to, you can still die during the cutscene while your movement is locked. That's unfortunate, but it's actually kind of fixed in Ultimate Mayhem. The island still gets clipped by the explosion, but rather than falling, your worm just is suspended in mid-air. If you hit any of the movement keys, you'll fall and die, but if you jump, you'll save yourself. It's a wonky fix, but I mean, I guess it gets the job done. It's better than nothing. Mission 27, Nobody Rides for Free, makes an interesting change. The enemy have gone from having bazookas to exclusively hit-scan weapons, and I think this is pretty cool. This is one of the more difficult missions in Worms 3D, but not in like a very fun way. You just have to like slowly make your way around pretty dangerous terrain and like hope that the enemy's bazooka shots miss. Since you always know which worm is going to be attacking you next turn, in Ultimate Mayhem, you can simply break line of sight using the terrain or a girder to ensure your safety, because it'll make the enemy skip go. I think this is nice. It adds a bit of strategy to a mission that was previously very RNG heavy. Mission 28, Hold Until Relieved, makes a small visual improvement. The point of this mission is to get 4 of your worms on the 4 control points, and then have 5 enemy turns end with all of those control points held down. This is fine, it's not too difficult, but in Worms 3D, to count how many turns left you have to do this, it sort of turns the round timer into a makeshift counter. It's a bit goofy, but in Ultimate Mayhem, there is actually just like a dedicated counter for how many turns left you need to do this for. It's a very small improvement, and honestly, I still think I prefer this mission in Worms 3D just because I prefer the Worms 3D engine, but this is undeniably an improvement. Ultimate Mayhem also adds one new addition that affects every single mission in the campaign, and that's the ability to restart missions. Worms 3D doesn't have this. You just have to quit out, go all the way back to the main menu, and then make your way back to the mission, which is really irritating. And you don't have to do that in Ultimate Mayhem, which is genuinely quite nice. That's also it for the good stuff, though. So we've got improvements to 4 missions, a quality of life feature, and that's it. So yeah, now onto the shit that makes me grumpy, because there's quite a lot of it. So, first of all, you know how I just gave credit to Worms Ultimate Mayhem for letting you restart Worms 3D missions? That is unfortunately kind of redundant thanks to an absolutely fucking baffling change. Unlike in Worms 3D, Worms 4 Mayhem, and the Worms 4 campaign, in Ultimate Mayhem, you cannot skip cutscenes in the Worms Ultimate Mayhem rendition of the Worms 3D campaign. What? I really don't understand how this happened, and it's really frustrating, because it severely undermines the ability to restart missions. Like, you'll restart the mission, which you're doing to save yourself time, but you're forced to watch the opening cutscene again. Which, granted, those vary in length, so sometimes it's not that bad, but it's like how? On top of not being skippable, the cutscenes are also just significantly worse in Ultimate Mayhem. In Worms 3D, the worms would do like little emotes and animations to like coincide with the dialogue and what was happening, like a cutscene. And in Ultimate Mayhem, this functionality is either just gone or completely broken. It's really sad. Mission 6, When Annelids Collide, has an especially egregious example of this that I'll let play now. Several voice banks from Worms 3D did not make the transition over to Ultimate Mayhem, which means that in a lot of missions, the enemy team will have a really ill-fitting voice bank for the theme of the mission. The game's first mission has a really egregious example of this, where you're fighting German soldiers, and instead of speaking German, they're disco dudes. Other than that, there are a few other small problems I have with this mission.
I'm gonna dance till I die.
First of all, you can no longer jump up the side of the cliff like you can in Worms 3D, and I think that's a real shame. This means that if you want to scale the cliff, you have to wait 4 turns for this crate that has 4 jetpacks in it. I know that's like how you're supposed to do this mission, but I don't know, I just found the other strat kind of fun. Hey, Big Yellow from the future chiming in real quick, because while getting footage for this video, turns out I found another way of getting up the cliff in Ultimate Mayhem, and it's very fun. It's called getting shot by the enemy into 2 landmines and getting fucking blasted all the way up to the cliff. You know, it doesn't really have anything to do with the quality of the mission, but it happened and I thought it was funny, so it's going in the video regardless. This one's also pretty nitpicky, but the second mission, Crate Britain, is hurt by slightly faster movement in my opinion. I like this mission a lot in Worms 3D, and that's mostly because of how enjoyable the process of beating it in a single turn is. It's genuinely quite tight, you have to do everything quite quickly, and I think that's slightly undermined by the faster movement in Ultimate Mayhem. It's a lot easier now, which takes some challenge out of the only thing I really liked about this mission. For my money, the 4th mission, A Leak in the Vegetable Patch, is the first mission to be made substantially worse in Ultimate Mayhem. I really don't like what they did with it. The point of this mission is to try and escape the water that rises at the end of every turn and use it to your advantage to defeat the much stronger enemy team. But in Worms 3D, you were given teleports to do this, and those use up your turn. So there's like an interesting dynamic here. Do I try and platform my way up, which is more difficult, or do I use the teleport, which is safer but costs a turn? Because Ultimate Mayhem doesn't have the teleport, you're given jetpacks instead, which don't use up your turn. So this just kind of completely removes that cool little dynamic that I liked. And also, even if you wanted to platform your way up, that's way more annoying now, because of the physics changes in Ultimate Mayhem. You're just gonna fucking slide off everything, it kinda sucks. So yeah, that's not cool. One last thing to note about this mission that doesn't really annoy me, it's just kind of odd, is Big Lad. I fucking talked about Big Lad before, he's very strange. In Worms 3D, this guy is supposed to spawn on top of this pot, but something goes wrong, he falls in, and like, lands in the pot, takes a single point of fall damage, and then drowns before his turn comes around. And they've like, fixed that incorrectly in Ultimate Mayhem. Because now he spawns properly, but they still spawned him in the pot. So he's still drowned before his turn comes around. He just doesn't take any fall damage. They just intentionally doomed him. What the fuck? Mission 5, Ice Maybe, is weird because they kind of fucked it up, but also I didn't like this mission, so I don't really know what to think. The point of this mission is to follow a linear path to the end and land on this switch. In Worms 3D, you were given freezes, and you could use these to, like, make yourself invulnerable to protect yourself from the enemy's attacks while you were doing that. In Ultimate Mayhem, they give you girders, and because girders don't take up your turn, you can just, like, skip the path completely. Like, you can just, like, put a girder in this gap here and jump straight to the switch in a single turn, like, pretty easily. Which is, like, stupid, but also, I never liked this mission, so, I don't know. Mission 7, Rum Deal, is fine in terms of gameplay, outside of slightly different jetpack handling, but it does highlight a few oddities in Ultimate Mayhem. For a start, Worms Ultimate Mayhem, unlike Worms 3D, doesn't really know how to handle crates that don't give you anything. Like, in Worms 3D, you're supposed to collect these crates, and you don't get a prompt when you pick them up, because, like, they don't actually contain anything. They're just things you need to collect. Ultimate Mayhem doesn't really know what to do, so it lets you know that you've collected 0 grenades every single time you pick one up. Which is a bit strange, but, you know, it is what it is. The opening cutscene also features a baffling oversight, where in Worms 3D, this NPC that gets deleted when the cutscene is over is, like, reacting to the fact that they're getting eaten by this squid. In Ultimate Mayhem, not only are they not doing that, but they're not even fucking placed correctly. You can barely see them. Like, how did they miss this? Also, another funny change in Ultimate Mayhem, when you beat this mission in Worms 3D, your worm just celebrates in the air. In Ultimate Mayhem, they don't do that, so they just fucking drown, which is a little funny. I guess I can give this mission points for that. Mission 9, Apple Core Island, is a little bit more annoying to me specifically, because the changes to the physics make it way more annoying to one turn. In Worms 3D, you can do a really particular jump to get up there in a single turn. In Ultimate Mayhem, you just kind of slide off, because you fucking slide off everything in this game, and I don't like that. You can beat the mission in one turn in Ultimate Mayhem too, it's just that I don't think the new methods are as interesting or fun. You can beat the mission, like, the way you're supposed to by getting the jetpack in one turn because of how much faster you are in Ultimate Mayhem, which is, like, fine. You can also do a jump here to set off the landmines on the apple and knock the vital crate down below where your worm can reach it. This looks really cool, but the catch is that it's RNG reliant due to the randomness of landmines in Ultimate Mayhem. And that really sucks, because each restart of this mission lumbers you with a now unskippable 35-second cutscene, which is longer than the fucking mission takes. Great. Although one change that they did make to this mission that I do like is that they gave the CPU grenades. In 3D, the only ranged option they have is the shotgun, so if you hide behind terrain, they'll just, like, really slowly chip away at you. But no, grenades do a lot more damage to the terrain, so giving them something like this is actually a smart change. Even if they're not always the smartest about using it. Also, in case you're wondering why I find losing the one turn in Applecart Island a disappointment, but I don't like the one in Ice Maybe, it's just a case-by-case basis on some of these being fun and some of these not being fun. For example, I liked the Applecart Island one turn. I think it's pretty fun in Worms 3D. However, there's a one turn in Worms 3D for Ice Maybe that is gone in Ultimate Mayhem. And I didn't mention it earlier because I'm glad that it's gone. It's not fun at all. Unlike something like the one in Great Britain, which is a consistently fun challenge, this one's not challenging at all outside of one extremely precise jump that loses you the mission if you fail it. I don't miss this in the slightest. Some one turns are good, some are bad, so yeah, that's pretty much what I'm getting at. Mission 10, Helter Skelter, makes 3 changes that I don't think are terrible, but are all really strange. In an odd twist of fate, this is the only mission going from Worms 3D to Ultimate Mayhem where the enemy used to wear hats, and now they don't. This is a byproduct of the broken cutscenes in Ultimate Mayhem, which is kind of a bummer. I thought this was cute. Also, for some reason, they changed the time of day this mission takes place in. It used to take place in the daytime, and now it's in the evening, and it's raining and grey and yucky. Don't know what's up with that. Also, really weird intentional change. The enemy have had their HP nerfed from 65 to 55. And I really don't know why. This was not a difficult mission. And, like, in Worms 3D, the bazooka did 55 damage, so you could argue maybe that's the thinking behind it, but it does 50 in this game. So, like, Mission 11, Take My Cherry, is very slightly worse off thanks to the removal of low gravity. Now you're supposed to use the Icarus potion to get this crate at the very end. It's not that much worse, but I just fucking hate the Icarus potion, so I am having marginally less fun. Mission 13, Shiver Me Timbers, one of my favourite missions from Worms 3D, has had one kind of cool and interesting part of it made less interesting, and I'm very grumpy. The point of this mission is to get the captain back to the ship and then kill off all of the enemy worms. In Worms 3D, you had multiple ways of going about this. You could just jump back, which was a little tricky, but you could also collect girders. Granted, those used up your turn, but they were a safe option. However, if you collected every single girder, you'd get given a crate with a jetpack in it, which meant you could get the captain back to land safely and without using a turn. The jump is no longer possible in Ultimate Mayhem, and since girders don't use up your turn anymore, there's no point in going for the jetpack. Again, kind of shit only I would be bothered by. But I don't know, it was kind of fun, and it made me happy, so I don't... It's still fun. This is still a really good mission, but... Mission 16, Tree Village Trouble, at least gameplay-wise, is doing pretty good. In fact, thanks to the faster movement, it might actually be a little bit better in Ultimate Mayhem. What I'm not happy about is the visuals. In Worms 3D, this mission had, like, a really lovely atmosphere. It took place in, like, a tropical evening, and the sky was, like, really nice and kind of purpley, and there was this really cool sunset. And in Ultimate Mayhem, it's just grey. It's just grey, and it's gross, and man, that's not fucking cool. They shouldn't have done that. I'm not happy. Mission 18, Worm in the Beanstalk, is fucking awful in Ultimate Mayhem. Like, this might be the most fucked up mission. I cannot fucking believe they let this shit slide. It's actually not okay. Okay, so to get the shitty nitpicky stuff out of the way before I actually talk about how fucking terrible this one is, the cloud that you start the mission on looks pretty fucking good in Worms 3D. It's nice, it's got transparency and shit, looks like a cloud. And in Ultimate Mayhem, it looks like dog shit. It looks really fucking bad. It's just a bunch of circles. And then, there's a second cloud, also. This is important. And in Worms 3D, that also looks like a cloud. It's great. In Ultimate Mayhem, you turn around and it's gone. And you're just like, oh, they removed the second cloud. No, they removed the graphics, but the collision is still there. Which, oh man, I'm not happy. There's like no reason to go back here in the actual mission. I'm just, I like this map a lot. I don't like that they're fucking with it. I'm not happy. But anyways, where this mission gets real bad is trying to do what you're supposed to do. You might notice that alongside the parachute you've been given, you now have access to infinite jetpacks in this mission, and that might seem like a nice idea. I initially thought that this was supposed to be used for safely getting your worms down to the boat at the end of the mission, if you happen to collect all of the targets with the parachute in one turn. It's a nice idea. I very quickly found out that's not why they gave you a jetpack, because the targets that you are supposed to use the parachute to collect in this mission are in the exact same spots as they were in Worms 3D, despite the fact the parachute controls completely fucking differently in Worms 4 Mayhem and Ultimate Mayhem. It's awful. In Worms 3D, you can press forward or back to control your speed, like how fast you move. And that's like really important for this mission. To make sure that you don't like overshoot or undershoot targets. And you can't in Ultimate Mayhem. You can only turn, and when you turn, your worm goes fucking flying all over the place, and it's awful. So doing this with the parachute, like you're supposed to, is hellish. It is virtually impossible. I really tried. When I played this on stream, I really fucking tried. Multiple times in Worms 3D, I have gotten every single target on the first go. Ultimate Mayhem, 2. I got 2. Okay, I need to try and swang into this one because I'm too low. God damn it. Oh my fucking god, dude. Jesus Christ, this is... So yeah, the jetpack is not like a cute little bonus that you get in this mission. It's a band-aid on a broken leg. Because to do this mission at all, basically, you just use the jetpack to get all of the targets. But for some fucking reason, unlike so many missions across both games, they didn't increase how much fuel is in the jetpack. So you'll like constantly run out of fuel, and you either have to land on the beanstalk and get a new jetpack, or like fumble about with the weapon menu mid-air and pop another jetpack. Like, I did not like this mission that much in Worms 3D. I think it's charming, but nothing special. What the fuck were they thinking? This is, like, actually dire. This is, like, maybe the worst thing I've experienced in a Worms game. It is... Ugh, I'm not happy. Not happy. Okay, so update. I don't know why, but after getting angry at a bad mission in Worms Ultimate Mayhem, my camera started bugging the fuck out, and now we have to finish the rest of this video with good lighting. God forbid. But yeah, anyways, in lighter news, moving on from a mission that's fucking awful, we've got a mission that's fine, but has some weird quirks, and that's the 20th mission, High Stakes. Gameplay-wise, this one's mostly fine, but my main gripes with it are the atmosphere, weirdly. In Worms 3D, this mission takes place at night, which for a mission themed around Dracula makes a lot of sense. And in Ultimate Mayhem, it takes place during the day. Which isn't very Dracula, I wouldn't think, but fuck, what do I know? Another strange thing about this mission is that it does a really good job at highlighting a really strange aspect of Worms Ultimate Mayhem. And that's that it doesn't really seem to know how to handle enemy worms that don't fight back at all. In Worms 3D, if Dracula Worm is the only enemy worm, he never gets a turn. Ultimate Mayhem doesn't really know how to handle this, so at the end of your turn, instead of it just becoming your next worm's turn, it's Dracula Worm's turn, he immediately wastes it, and then it's your next worm's turn. It's just really strange and wastes a bit of time, just shows a general lack of polish. It's kind of unfortunate. Mission 22, all cooped up, is mostly fine, but due to the general small scale of the map, I think it's the mission where the larger blast radius and detection radius on the landmines really hampers you the most. It's very, very difficult to get around these landmines here, and it's very easy to end up with your worms getting poisoned. Mission 24, Showdown at the OK Coral Reef, is mostly good, especially in terms of gameplay, but it does highlight an interesting quirk of this game. There's other missions that have this problem, but this is the one where I encountered it. The fact that blast weapons can cause knockback without inflicting damage mean that it's possible for the vital crate that you need to collect to beat the mission to be knocked into the water but not necessarily blown up. If this happens, you've soft-blocked yourself, and even if you beat all the enemy worms, you can no longer beat the mission. It's not a huge issue, I guess, since it's pretty hard for this to happen, but it is a little bit funny, I think. Mission 29, Too Boldly Go, is not significantly worse in my opinion, but firstly, it was already really bad, and secondly, any kind of platforming-based mission, especially one this precarious, is inherently going to be worse off thanks to the different physics in Worms Ultimate Mayhem. It is very easy to slide off shit while jumping up here, and it's very irritating. In Mission 30, Beautiful Balloon, thanks to the fact it's, not in the game, you no longer have access to the teleport, which removes kind of a fun dynamic in my opinion. In Worms 3D, you had the option of giving up a turn to teleport onto one of the enemy's planes, so at the cost of a turn, you could set up a really, really free shot on a later turn. So that's gone now. It's a bit of a bummer. There's also, a notable lack of polish when it comes to the main gimmick of this mission. The gimmick is that the water rises at the end of every turn by quite a significant amount, and that's supposed to represent your ship running out of fuel. To remedy this, you're supposed to collect crates, and in Worms 3D, when you do that, you get a nice little side view pointing out that you collected fuel and that the water's lowering. Ultimate Mayhem is missing the text, and instead eagerly lets you know that you've collected 0 cluster bombs. Which, it doesn't change anything gameplay-wise, it's just, again, quite indicative of this game's lack of polish. Mission 31, A Good Night's Sheep, is perfectly fine gameplay-wise, but in terms of the cutscenes being messed up in Ultimate Mayhem, this is the absolute worst offender. The point of this mission is that the Colonel here has insomnia, and you're supposed to make Sheep jump over these fences 3 times to help him fall asleep. In Worms 3D, it's very obvious that he is sleepy, and he visibly gets more sleepy every time you make a Sheep jump over the fences, and then when you finish the mission, he actually falls asleep, and then these little Zeds come off him to represent that, and all of that is fucked up in Ultimate Mayhem. He's just, the game is telling you he's getting sleepy, and he fucking smiles at you with his big old grin. And then, when you beat the mission, he doesn't fall asleep. He's just sitting there, but the Z's still come off him like he's asleep. It's just, again, really indicative of this game's lack of polish. It's quite irritating. Although one thing I will give this mission in Ultimate Mayhem, it's a sleep-themed mission, and in Worms 3D it took place in day, and now it takes place at night. That's cool. I'll give you that. Mission 32, Beefcake Breakfast Brawl, is one that really grinds my gears, because this is one of Worms 3D's best, but also most difficult missions. And in Ultimate Mayhem, it is substantially easier. Navigating this level's terrain in Worms 3D is genuinely quite tricky. You do start the mission with low gravities, but you've only got 2 of them, and they're not ideal for traversal. They're handy for sure, but they're relatively slow and they'll only get you so far. Other than that, you just have girders and potentially a bridge kit, which use up your turn, so they're not ideal. Which is fine, that adds to the challenge, I quite enjoy that. In Ultimate Mayhem, you start with 3 Icarus potions, which make it, really easy to get anywhere you want. Well, outside of the fact that the Icarus potion, it controls like shit, in my opinion, but other than that, yeah, you can just get anywhere, really easily, and I don't like that. The difficulty was a huge part of what made this mission so fun, and you've just, completely trivialized a massive part of it. In Mission 33, Costa del Danger, the Worms 3D arcade machine has been replaced with an arcade machine for Alien Breed 3. And lastly, the game's final mission, Mission 35, Alien Juice Suckers, has also been hurt a little bit in terms of traversal. In Worms 3D, this mission gives you a teleport near the beginning, and it's one of the only missions where I think you genuinely want to use the teleport. In Worms 3D, all of your worms are on the low ground, while the enemy have the high ground, and considering there's an island over here that has a bunch of valuable crates, giving up a turn just to move with a teleport might actually be worth it. Again, no teleport in Ultimate Mayhem, they give you a jetpack, doesn't use up your turn, trivializes the movement, it's kind of a bummer. But other than that, this mission is still pretty cool. So yeah, those are all the missions that were changed from Worms 3D going to Ultimate Mayhem that I have a problem with. Barring two. There's two missions that I'm really disappointed in that I deliberately left out. And it's kind of a funny coincidence, because they are the mission that I think is the worst mission in Worms 3D, and the mission I think is the best in Worms 3D. Those being Placeholder and Ragnarok and Roll respectively. I really dislike how these two were changed, so let's talk about it. Starting with Placeholder. Placeholder is an extremely gimmicky mission, and in Worms 3D, it's basically just a series of you doing exactly what you're told to do over and over again. You're just placed into very linear scenarios where you can only do one thing, and you just do them. You shoot the tour guide, you collect a crate with a jetpack, you use that to get another jetpack, you use that to get 2 girders, you use the 2 girders to get this crate up here, and then you use the parachute to hide from an earthquake. It's pretty lame, honestly. But I think this mission, more than any, is the most indicative when it comes to the lack of polish in Ultimate Mayhem. For a start, unlike Worms 3D, if you miss your bazooka shot for whatever reason, instead of just being given another bazooka, you lose. Because again, this game just doesn't seem to know how to handle enemy worms who don't fight back getting their turn. And this is extra weird because this mission gives you access to the skip go. And if you use it, you just automatically lose, so I don't know what the thinking is here. An issue I had with this mission in Worms 3D was its abundance of unskippable cutscenes. There were 3 in total, but you could skip the first one. It would usually show you where the first jetpack crate spawned, but by shooting the tour guide from where it spawns, you could collect it immediately and skip straight to the second cutscene. This still works in Ultimate Mayhem, but for some reason, it breaks something to do with the text, and it just bugs out every other cutscene afterwards. This doesn't seem to be super consistent. It didn't happen to me on stream, but I've had it happen both in my own time and when I was playing the game on Steam Deck. So, I don't fully know what triggers this, but it's a bit strange. Another issue with the unskippable cutscenes in Worms 3D is that you could softlock yourself by equipping or using the utility that you got that triggered them. This is fixed in Ultimate Mayhem. But unfortunately, it's been replaced by a much worse and easier to trigger softlock. You can softlock yourself out of the last unskippable cutscene, not by really doing anything intentionally, but by landing on a crate that you are supposed to fly to. And then that brings us to the last part of the mission. In Worms 3D, you get the crate on top of the lighthouse, and then you are warned of an earthquake. You're supposed to find somewhere to hide from the earthquake, wait for it, then you get crates that have low gravities in them, and then you use them to collect the final crate that beats the mission. Neither the earthquake or low gravity are in Ultimate Mayhem, so you might wonder how they went about this. And the answer is, they didn't. You get the crate with the parachute in it, you are told an earthquake happened, and then the final crate just spawns, and you're meant to use the parachute to get that. Which, like, come on, we're not even fucking trying now. Like, man, maybe I'm silly for being grumpy that a mission I think is awful is now shorter because a part of it got cut. But, like, the way in which it was done just feels really bad. And now, going from what I consider the worst mission in Worms 3D to the best mission in Worms 3D, we're going from just a lack of care and polish to a really stupid intentional decision. I think Ragnarok and Roll in Worms 3D is brilliant. It's one of the game's most challenging missions. It's a 1v7. and navigating it is really cool. It almost kind of feels like lightning in a bottle. Like, in this one mission, in this one part of the campaign, they kind of almost accidentally perfected the 3D Worms formula. Like, it's not just a good Worms mission that happens to be 3D, but this is something that actively benefits from the 3D Worms engine. The numerous ways you can use cover to preserve your limited HP, and like the huge number of options you have for approaching any scenario, it's genuinely brilliant. In Worms Ultimate Mayhem, it's gone from a 1v7 to a 1v5. And granted, the enemy worm have been given slightly more health to compensate, but I really can't stress enough how much easier and how much less interesting this makes the mission. And like, this is the only mission that really feels like it was nerfed in this way, and I don't think it was necessary. I know a lot of people found the original quite difficult, but it's the penultimate mission. Fair enough. And it really feels like they kind of ruined it, and I'm not happy. It's not like they ruined it through a lack of polish or care, they just decided to make it worse, and I'm grumpy about it. And speaking of a lack of care and polish, I think my absolute biggest problem with the Worms 3D campaign in Ultimate Mayhem is that that's it. That's kind of all the Worms 3D content you get in Ultimate Mayhem. The only other content from Worms 3D that's been added to Ultimate Mayhem is that the map Hook, Line, and Skimmer, which was not available for multiplayer in Worms 3D, being exclusive to the game's single-player campaign, is now available for multiplayer in Worms Ultimate Mayhem. And that's it. That's all the Worms 3D content you get, and I think that's really disappointing, especially for a game that's marketing itself as the definitive 3D Worms experience. It would be strange to add things like Worms 3D's tutorial to Ultimate Mayhem, but like, why not add the maps from the tutorial to the game's multiplayer? 5 of the 6 maps were available in Worms 3D's multiplayer, and some of them were really good. There's a few real winners in there, like the Atlantis Training Facility, or Return to Shadow Assassin. Why not add any of Worms 3D's challenges, or the Worms 3D death matches? They were really good, especially the last few, which were really quite difficult. And the Worms 3D death matches also had that exclusive Titanic map. Why not make that map available for multiplayer? It was available for multiplayer in a Worms 3D demo and not in the final game. I'm sure people would have loved to see it. But no. All we got was the Worms 3D campaign. And it's not even the best version of the Worms 3D campaign. And that's what frustrates me. But I'm not angry about it, I'm just kind of disappointed. It's kind of like a Sonic Adventure DX situation, right? I think Sonic Adventure DX is very fun. It's pretty cool. And I also think that Worms Ultimate Mayhem is fun. And I think the Worms 3D campaign in Worms Ultimate Mayhem is fun. That's fine. But Sonic Adventure DX, especially the Steam version, is kind of notorious for being the worst way to play Sonic Adventure. And I would argue that the Worms 3D campaign in Ultimate Mayhem is very much the same. But what's so frustrating is that both of them are the easiest and most convenient way to play both of those respective things. So many people are going to end up with Adventure DX on Steam, and like I've mentioned, you can't buy Worms 3D anymore. It's not available digitally anywhere. If you want to play the Worms 3D campaign, most people are going to go to the Worms 3D campaign in Ultimate Mayhem. Most people are going to flock to the worst version of this thing that I think is genuinely pretty cool. And even if it's not worse by a huge margin, that just feels kind of bad. I can excuse missing so many other cool things from Worms 3D. I can excuse the missing weapons, I can excuse the missing challenges, I can excuse forgetting the way cooler random map generator, and I guess if you really pushed me, I could excuse the fact that matches still have a 16 worm limit. In Worms 3D and Worms 4 Mayhem, you're not able to have more than 16 worms in a match, so if you've 4 players, you can't use teams of 6, only teams of 4. I assume that was for hardware-related reasons, and it just wasn't fixed in Ultimate Mayhem, even though that hardware is quite a bit better. I don't know why that's the case, but like whatever. I could excuse all of that, but what really doesn't sit right with me is the fact that there's no just normal Worms 3D anymore for us to go and get and play and enjoy for all of its unique merits. I think Worms 3D is genuinely a really great game, and it frustrates me how difficult Team 17 have made it for us to enjoy it. I just wish people could go out there, buy this game, and let me know what they think of it. And they can. If you want this game, you're gonna have to emulate it or get it physically, which, good fucking luck. Maybe wanting a re-release of Worms 3D is a bit of a monkey's paw, because I know Team 17 does not have the best track record with Worms re-releases. I mean, the Steam version of Armageddon is fantastic, but then you've got Worms World Party Remastered, and very recently, you've got Worms Armageddon Anniversary Edition, which, while it's got a lot of neat features, it's missing shit as basic as private lobbies. That came out this year, what are we doing? If you have any means of doing so, I would recommend Worms 3D. And despite everything I've had to say, I would not dissuade you from trying Worms Ultimate Mayhem or the Worms 3D campaign in Ultimate Mayhem. Just keep all that shit that I said about Worm and the Beanstalk at the back of your mind. Alright? Whoa, look at that, another video done. Sorry this one took so long. I feel like this took a lot longer than it should have, but you know, video's done now, hope you liked it. And big thank you to all my Patreons and channel members. So yeah, we'll go through all of them now, starting with the Patreons. So big thank you to Dustin Comet, Robert Helender, Silverkey5, Reboot, Sombret, Henry Zelenka, Sovereign in Exile, Michael H., Richard Davis, Ara Deadgal, Baron O'Beefdip, Te, Bewilled243, Johnny362,000, Memories Adrift, Frankie Mark, Another Ignored Beast, Eric, Ada Basilisk, Osiris, Duvizero, Looney Maroon, Lascole, Armop, Eric Lanning, Teal Opal, Jam, Carter Richter, Bretzi, Barely, Zero Gum, Strawberry, Ewan Phillip, Bingleton, JE3, Metallicy, Pink Hat Boy, Rio, Genny but she's a bit fruity, Wolftree, Ethan Hughes, Kai D, Excellent Tone, Odd One Out, Wizard McMagic, Putnam, Snacker Fork, Happy Calcium, Cordy, Beanie, Eminon Advance, Blame P, Lonsir, EBGB, 18 Quintillion Planets, O'Miller, Armuda, CS, Daniel Drexler, Ben Gets Weird, Yoshinero, Isola Delfina, Kino, Sup, Phasing, PJ Schwa, Wolfrey, Lorelei Cortez, Alberto Leon, Stout Shaco, Old Man Han, Doctor of Journalism, Nigel O, Aquan, Erica, Jared Diamond, Lucy the Lamilla, Kibbybit, Zon, Ash C. Adams, Bravely Typed, VV Venomous, Skeleton, Cram, Tamiyaki, Dad Sato, Motobono 9, Invertas, Kobe Fan, Mahogany, Sword Off Laser, Ernesto Flores, Robbie Shin, Braden Wist, January November, and Rosie YY. Big thank you to all of you, and on top of that, also gotta thank the channel members. Whoa, would you look at that? Big thank you to Fueg, Dandus, Multio6, King Yef, Ami Kitsune, Bro Dudaman, Cher, Vectas, Snowdrop, Kathy.uk, Mains of 45, CK Eternity, and New Soup V. Big thanks to all of you so much for helping make this possible. So yeah, that's it. Bye bye.